Okay, so I'm going to talk about inequality and capitalism and what you can do about it. And I'm an economist, so let's look at some numbers. Here's some data from the World Inequality Report 2018. And it's a simple measure of inequality, which is the proportion of national income that accrues to the 10% richest people. So, if you were in a completely equal society, the richest 10% of people would get 10% of income, just like the poorest 10%. In fact, it wouldn't even make sense to talk about the richest and the poorest. But of course, the world isn't like that. There's a lot of inequality in the world. And I wanted to just start by talking about some numbers and ask, where does this inequality come from? Okay? So, for example, take Brazil. According to this team's calculations, 55% of national income in Brazil accrues to the richest 10% of the population. That's very similar in other Latin American countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, very unequal. Actually, it's not really Sub-Saharan Africa. The data comes from South Africa, and I'll talk a little bit about South Africa in a minute. There's the US and Canada. 47% of national income accrues to the richest 10%. And according to their data, the most equal part of the world is Europe. 37% of national income accrues to the richest 10% of the population. So I just want to talk a little bit about this variation in the world and where it comes from and what's it got to do with capitalism. Okay? So let me start with Latin America. This is an artist's impression of what was to be the new airport in Mexico City. Okay? I say was to be because the new president, López Obrador, recently canceled the contract and just scrapped the whole plan. So it's interesting that the airport was going to be built by Carlos Slim, the seventh richest person in the world. He has a fortune of about $70 billion. It was designed by his son-in-law, separate contract. Okay? Now, how did Carlos Slim get his $70 billion? He got his $70 billion because the same political party that gave him the contract to build the airport previously privatized the national telecom monopoly to him. Okay? He got an enormous monopoly. Now, a distinguished University of Chicago economist, Arnold Harbinger, developed the methodology that economists use to measure the welfare costs of monopoly. And the OECD calculated that Carlos Slim's monopolies reduced national income in Mexico by 2% a year. Okay? So in Latin America, the way to make money, a huge source of inequality, is monopoly. What about South Africa? What about Sub-Saharan Africa? It's actually South Africa. How did South Africa become so unequal? South Africa became very unequal because of a system called apartheid. Okay? Apartheid has deep roots historically, but you could say that it really got going in 1913, when they divided South Africa into the white economy and the black economy. The whites were about 15% of the population. They got 87% of the land. The blacks, 80%, got 13%. Okay? In the white economy, black people couldn't own property, they couldn't own land, they couldn't run a business. They couldn't undertake any skilled or professional job. What could they do? They could work as unskilled laborers in mines and in agriculture. Okay? So the enormous inequality in South Africa was created by an economy which was designed to exploit black people for the benefit of white people. Was that a capitalist economy? Not sure. If you've read Marx, Marx thought that the genius, kind of subversive genius of capitalism was that you kept on exploiting workers without overt coercion. But there was an awful lot of overt coercion that created that level of inequality in South Africa. What about Mexico? Is that capitalism? Well, it's monopolies and barriers to entry. It's certainly not a kind of type of capitalism that economists would enjoy. what about Europe? How come Europe became so equal? Okay, let me look at some European numbers. This is a more fine-grained measure of inequality, where instead of looking at the top 10%, the richest 10% of the population, the team at this World Inequality Report look at the richest 1% of the population, okay? So now I'm not looking at the fraction of income which accrues to the richest 10%, but to the richest 1%. And here they plot Germany, Spain, France, and Italy. And I want to point out a few facts here. So just look at the green line, the light green line at the top, which is Germany. So what this says is about 12% of national income accrues to the richest 1% of people in Germany. But when you look at that figure, which goes back over 100 years, the big picture that strikes you is actually Germany is a heck of a lot more equal now than it was in the 1920s or 1930s. And that's also the picture with France, which is the red line. They're much more equal. Yeah, inequality's gone up in the last 20 years, but actually in both countries it's at more or less the same level it was in the 1960s, and it's much lower than it was in the interwar years. So what's all the fuss about with inequality? We can see why there's fuss in South Africa and Mexico, but what's all the fuss about inequality? Well, here's the fuss, okay? The dynamics in inequality are very different in different parts of the world. The levels are very different, and the dynamics are different. Inequality may not have gone up a lot in France and Germany, but of course it has gone up an awful lot in the United States and Britain. So there's the blue line. The blue line, the dark blue line at the top, shows you that since 1980, the proportion of national income that goes to the richest 1% of the population has actually doubled. Okay, it's gone up enormously from about 10% to 20%. I'm just emphasizing that's not the picture everywhere. It is, of course, the picture in England. That's also dramatically increased. But the first point I want to make with these examples is that I don't know if these are all capitalist countries or not. They all have markets, they all have business people, they have investment. They have enormously different levels of inequality, okay? And even the changes are different. How come inequality hasn't gone up in Germany and France the way it's gone up in the US and in Britain? Is that to do with globalization or technological change? But Germany and France are very globalized. They're just as globalized as Britain is. They're probably more globalized than the United States. They have the same technology, cutting edge. So why hasn't inequality gone up the same everywhere? That's because the institutions are extremely different. That in France and Germany, there's a commitment to a welfare state and the role for the government in redistributing and promoting inclusion that disappeared in Britain and maybe never existed in the United States. And to think more about that, look at when the inflection point happens here, okay? When is it that inequality starts going up in the US? It's about 1980. When does it go up in the UK? About 1980. What happened in 1980? I remember the first time I voted in an election in England was in 1979. I voted against Mrs. Thatcher. I'm still very proud of that. What did Mrs. Thatcher do? Mrs. Thatcher undermined the trade union movement. She deregulated everything she could get her hands on. She tried to withdraw the state from social provision or any kind of commitment to equality in the society. And Ronald Reagan did exactly the same thing. That never happened in France and Germany. In fact, at the same time Mrs. Thatcher was getting elected, the French were voting for François Mitterrand, who wanted to intensify this model of social democracy rather than put it into retreat. Okay? So these inequality dynamics and the differences across countries show you that there's no simple relationship between globalization and technology and inequality. It all depends on your national institutions, your labor market institutions, the commitment of the government to do something about inequality in society. There's lots of different ways that capitalism can be organized with very different consequences for inequality. But here you don't see the costs in terms of prosperity. France and Germany are very prosperous, economically successful countries. So if I look at this and I say, like many people living in the United States, we're very worried about inequality. What can you do about inequality? Well, on the one hand, there's a very optimistic message here. It says, look, there's an alternative way of organizing things that can actually promote equality, that can eradicate these inequities that have disappeared. But I think it would be naive to say that's an easy coalition to put together, and it's a heck of a lot more difficult to put that together in the United States or Britain than it used to be. And let me illustrate that idea with a cartoon that I like very much. So this is Saul Steinberg's famous cartoon from the cover of the New Yorker in 1976. It's called A View of the World from 9th Avenue. Okay? So what can you see about the world from 9th Avenue? I'm actually more interested in the view of the United States from 9th Avenue. Let's focus on that. Okay? You can see Manhattan, bustling, skyscrapers, prosperity, and then what's now called the flyover country. It's an image of a sort of core, center, civilized, and a periphery. Okay? And that's an unusual image for me in the United States. You know, I work a lot in Latin American countries. This is very familiar. This is the view of Colombia from Bogota. This is the view of Argentina from Buenos Aires. It's true about many other unequal poor countries. It's the view of the Philippines from Manila. It's very familiar to me. But I've always thought the United States wasn't like that. The United States have the Sierra Club. You know, they like, the periphery is glamorous. Cowboys are heroic. There's no Colombian or Peruvian John Wayne. Cowboys are barbaric and uncivilized in Latin America. They're heroes in the US. The US have always had a very different relationship between the different parts of the country. But it seems to me that that has deteriorated immensely. And this core periphery type of dynamic has a lot to do with how difficult it is today to kind of construct a political coalition that can have some solidarity, that can have some vision of how things could be done in such a way as to reduce inequality. And this dynamic is very prevalent in Britain too. This is the street where my mother grew up, in Middlesbrough. It's in a place called South Bank in the Tees, in the north of England. You can see it's booming. This is not when my mother was born. This is 3 years ago. Okay? Look at that. So here's peripheral Britain. What did these people do when they got a chance to vote for Brexit? They voted for Brexit. Okay? Here's the River Tees here, and this is North Yorkshire. 60 to 70% of people voted for Brexit. Okay? So you could say it's populism, but you know, when I look at this data and I think about this turning point, I don't think of inequality as causing populism. I think of inequality was caused by populism. What was Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher if not populists, and very nationalistic populists at that? Mrs. Thatcher endlessly stoked antagonism towards the European Union in Britain when she was Prime Minister, and she left a political legacy in many ways, and I think Brexit was part of it. So this is what really worries me about the United States, and it's what really worries me about the UK. And let me end by talking about one other manifestation of this core periphery dynamics. Here's a photo I like showing a lot. I don't know what Bill Gates, he probably doesn't like me showing it. But all publicity is good publicity, right? So this is Bill Gates in 1998. What's he doing? He's giving evidence to antitrust authorities in Washington, D.C. He's swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He was dragged in front of antitrust regulations, and Microsoft were found guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay? I'd like showing this picture because it reminds me of what I like about the United States, about the rule of law, about how the richest guy in the world can be dragged in front of antitrust authorities and found guilty. This picture, is impossible to imagine in Mexico or Colombia, or just no way that's ever going to happen, okay? I don't know, this was 1998. You could say, well, it wouldn't happen anymore in the United States, but I'd let the law professor hold forth on that one. I'm just an economist, okay? But when I think about these core periphery dynamics in places where I know, one of the things that you see is this separation of elites from the rules. The elites are above the law. Bill Gates wasn't above the law. Elites don't want to pay taxes. Elites don't feel solidarity. You can self-provide more or less anything in Latin America. You can self-provide security, you can self-provide education, you can self-provide healthcare, or you can get on a plane to Miami. You can't self-provide a stable currency, but most things you can self-provide. You detach yourself from society, and you don't feel connected to it anymore or feel accountable or responsible to it. And I think, let me end with this picture, which is Mark Zuckerberg not turning up to a very high-powered panel of politicians from all over Europe who are charged to investigate fake news and disinformation, a lot of it being propagated on Facebook. You can see they tweeted this in exasperation. There's a seat with Mark Zuckerberg's name on it, and there's an empty chair. In Colombia, in South America, where I work a lot, the empty chair is a sort of metaphor for everything that's wrong with the country. It's meant to sort of describe no one shows up. Nobody cares. Nobody wants to participate. Nobody wants to talk. Nobody wants to be responsible for anything. There's the empty chair. There's even the most interesting political website in Colombia is called The Empty Chair. And it's a statement about the disengagement of elites from the society they're living in. That's something that Latin American countries have been characterized by for a long time. And it's very disturbing to me that the United States or Britain might be going in the same direction. Thank you.